Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Velina Tchakarova. Velina is the director at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna, Austria. Her work includes research, consulting, and lectures on global system transformation and geostrategy of global actors, particularly the EU's role in Eastern Europe. If you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Velina, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the projects you're working on today.
Okay, so my name probably reveals already my background, which is that I am originally from Bulgaria. This is Southeastern Europe. And I've been living in Austria, which is Central Europe, for the last 15 years now. So my specialty, my fields of expertise are mostly in the field of global system processes and structures, global order, shifts of change, mostly systemic shifts of change. But also, I'm very much interested in global and regional actors' constellations. And this is this kind of processes, developments, trends, but also scenarios are basically at the core of my research, my work. And I'm applying a systems thinking, systems approach, and also geopolitical, geoeconomic, and realpolitik approach.
Fantastic. I want to get into all that. We're futurists here, and we've had forecasters and scenario planners on to talk about their methodologies. But I thought we would start at kind of a place that might seem a little silly. And I was wondering if you could just define geopolitics. I mean, in a sense, it's in the name, right? But I often find that when you dig in a little bit, the way that people who work in fields conceptualize their own work is richer than you might think just based on the name of the field. So how do you conceive of the field that you work in?
Okay. So in order to arrive at my term of geopolitics and geoeconomics, I would like to start with my term for realpolitik, because I'm basically placed in a kind of a corner of political science and international relations. And I would like to draw your attention to basically to a German journalist and politician from the 19th century, who actually articulated a new way of understanding politics and the distribution of power at that time, of course, in Europe, but it is meanwhile applicable also to world affairs. And he basically defined this term of realpolitik as a kind of a more or less the true motor behind national interests and calculations and goals, which is more or less aimed at the struggle for mastery in the relations between the main actors. Now, 200 years fast forward, I would paraphrase this kind of definition by claiming that realpolitik, at least the way I see it, also from my experience, in analyzing and assessing global affairs for the last 20 years, is that basically realpolitik is the true motor of global affairs, serving at best as a kind of a pious smokescreen for the struggle of mastery and power in an extremely interconnected world. So derived from this realpolitik definition, I look at geopolitics and geoeconomics as these two interconnected main pillars of realpolitik. So basically, main pillars of the struggle for power, mostly of state actors, but we are also observing increasingly the role of transnational actors, corporations, organizations, and so on.
So that was Bismarck, right?
That is not only Bismarck, of course. This is a summary of many centuries of political thinking and political philosophy, and I kind of summarized it in a very, very short way. But basically, the geoeconomics is where the states seek to impose control over the logic of trade, refining use of economic tools and instruments, mostly based on their macroeconomic portfolio, to attain these geopolitical objectives, which is basically state politics derived from geographic factors and variables.
So
make it very, very short for you.
Right. So a lot of that boiled down to the control for the desire for power. And I wonder if you might comment on that just as a concept and how it's changed over time, because it seems like this struggle has always been with us for as long as there have been humans and as long as there have been competing human societies on a finite world. But I'm sure it's changed rather a lot in the internet era, where weapons might just as much be, bots on Facebook or Twitter influencing elections or something like that as missiles or tanks or something else. So how has power evolved over time?
Well, at the level of international relations, and of course, that means mostly state relations. Geopolitics is exactly this kind of helpful method of studying foreign security defense policy in order to understand, but also explain international political behavior. Like I said, based on these geographical variables. And geopolitics has always focused on political power linked to the geographic space. So over the last few centuries, of course, a lot has changed. I would not go into 5,000 years or 2,000 years of history of humankind, because during that time we also had a lot of examples of empires, great powers behavior, which was not really much different. But I would like to focus mostly on, let's say, on modern history of humankind, where we experienced this kind of specific behavior by, let's say, a global power. And if we look back at the 20th century, we had the example and the really excellent research of, let's say, for instance, the British geographer Halford Mackinder, who launched the heartland theory. And he actually analyzed struggle for power specifically between sea-based and land-based powers. So this was a kind of a new approach from the perspective of history and the perspective of geography, using this kind of indicators. And I would claim that he was pretty much right about not just about the behavior of states. During that time, he was analyzing, of course, mostly the place of Great Britain in the world. This one really, so to say, great power, a power that had developed kind of capabilities for global power projection, which later on, as another example, was basically transferred to the United States. geography was a main factor, but he also acknowledged the role of technology. And this is another component that I would like to stress very shortly, because it was the first and the second wave of the industrial revolutions that also made Great Britain a kind of a global power, which also established through connectivity and infrastructure and sea lines, so basically maritime transport routes, all of this kind of web of connections to the rest of the world. But also it was the first and the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, which for Great Britain was this kind of additional important factor to make it that great. And later on in the 70s, when we had another situation between two competitors, two superpowers competing over the control, once again, struggle for power, and who is going to be at the top. It was the third industrial revolution, once again, a role of technology where United States managed to ride the wave and to win the competition against the Soviet Union, and which was also the basically the outcome which made United States that kind of really superpower, unique kind of a superpower that could then establish all of these intertwined networks following the collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 90s, and which resulted in something absolutely phenomenal in my view. And we are still in the middle of this phenomenon, and that is this kind of what I call global system of intertwined socioeconomic networks, which are more or less, a result, an outcome of a globalization led, shaped by the United States following the end of the Cold War. And basically, the Cold War was won by one of the two superpowers, and the other one could impose its own view of the global order, its rules of the game, its networks, and the unanticipated outcome of this was this kind of globalized world affairs, which also is the very first time in the history of this modern history of humankind where we have also a global capitalist system, because most of the states are right now having a capitalist open market economy. Okay, so I would end here, and maybe I can also elaborate a little bit more on all of these concepts.
Yeah, please. I want to come back to Halford Mackinder because I have some questions about the heartland theory and how it might apply today. But I wanted to follow up on a comment you made about the role that America has played in shaping the world order in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the way you laid it out, it made it sound like the United States' triumph in that conflict is sort of responsible for the way that the world is interconnected today. But I mean, I would argue that trade routes and sort of globalization goes back at least to the Columbian Exchange in the 16th century. So in what ways is America responsible for how interconnected the world is today? Like what has been her role in shaping the global order?
Of course, like I said, this is not the first time, and it's not a unique historical episode. But I suggested at the beginning that we more or less focus now on the latest examples of a kind of global powers, and I took the example with Great Britain, based on the geopolitics approach, and then moved to the United States as the second global power, which is still, by the way, the only superpower with global power projections, the only power in the world that is capable not only to project its power in every corner of the world, but also to influence, to control, to deploy at any point, at any terrestrial or maritime spot on the map, troops or presence, or actually to answer your question, the free flow of goods, of capital, of services, of data, and so on, that is been enabled by the entanglement of these networks that I named, is actually possible because there is one power in charge,
one hegemonic
power in charge that actually provides for this security, guarantees the free flow, and actually this is the way it goes. This is actually the main indicator that makes it different from all the other competitors or regional powers with global power aspirations, and so on and so on. So we are still in a situation, even now in 2021, where there is actually only one power with this kind of global power projection, and the power that actually also has the global reserve currency, which is also guaranteed by the capabilities to deploy and to secure wherever it's necessary or wherever national interests are at stake. So this is basically, once again, the Thucydides' concept of the strong do what they must. So basically, the strong do what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. So that means that whenever national interests are at stake, global power, contrary to all other powers with limited resources or limited power projection capabilities, can do whatever it likes. But you mentioned something everything it likes, it finds considers necessary. But you also mentioned something interesting, which is also, I think, important aspect, and that is whenever we have a situation of a global power, there is definitely a hegemon. There is also a situation of competitors trying to compete for control and to secure their interests in a kind of a situation wherever the vacuum allows it, wherever there is a void and it can be filled, there will be such competitors that will try to also maximize their gains by forming, for instance, alliances and partnerships, or by building enough capabilities to project power beyond the national realm. And this is exactly the situation where we are right now, once again. So nothing new, in a situation where you can imagine how the pendulum is swinging back and forth. And right now we are once again in this kind of a fragile equilibrium where the hegemon is getting weakened, but still is staying at the level of a global power projection. And then there is a second center of power, which is currently being built by China, together, of course, with partnerships and with alliances and with minor partners. And this is basically now the systemic competitor of United States. And this kind of systemic competition is simultaneously taking place in all fields, in all key domains. It's not just a trade dispute as it is often being presented in mass media, or it's not just taking place at the level of diplomacy, for instance, or political relations, but is simultaneously taking place in all key domains and fields. So, of course, the open question mark is as to whether China will manage to create this kind of secondary system of power, how big it will be, and will it be this kind of a unique, to go back to the concepts of geopolitics, will it be this kind of unique Asian power that will simultaneously build not just a rim, so basically is not going to turn into a rim power as the United States was, but is going to also become kind of a land power in the large Eurasian landmass, which of course is another term from the geopolitics. It's a term introduced by Nicholas Spikeman, who basically added it to the heartland theory of Mackinder, and many authors and experts, for instance, argue that China is basically trying to compete with the United States in the rimland, and we are already observing these kind of tensions that are taking place in, for instance, South China Sea, in the Indian Ocean. But I argue that China is preparing for both. So next to this, we are going to observe also increasingly tensions along the line of actual control with India. So there will be also this grasp for quest for power in the heartland, and this is going to happen. It is going to be possible only in a systemic coordination with Russia, which still considers Eurasia as a kind of a near abroad. And this is where this kind of dragon bear concept kicks in, which I have developed for the last 7-8 years, where most of the authors and experts argue that both China and Russia will be competitors in Eurasia, and I actually argue that they will somehow come up with this systemic coordination in various fields and domains, and will actually cooperate to prevent third actors such as United States and partners from interfering and filling the Eurasian void.
Right. So you covered Dragon Bear. We're going to get back to that. That's one of the things that's distinctive about your work. I was curious, though, as we're moving into a world that is characterized by multipolar power centers, if you think that a stable and peaceful world order requires a single hegemon in charge of everything, or is it possible, game theoretically or geopolitically, for the dragon bear in the East and the United States to sort of share power in a way that doesn't lead to war or escalating tensions, or is that just not an equilibrium that will hold?
Well, everything is possible, of course. And there is indeed a future scenario where, for instance, let's say the two systems of power, United States and China, have already decoupled, and given that they have basically created their own networks of, socioeconomic systems, they have separated internet space, they have separated the satellites, they have, their trade and economic space. They decide that direct confrontation would really result in a mass destruction. So both agree on a kind of a peaceful coexistence a peaceful coexistence of two separated systems, of two more or less alternative universes. And the one is still being shaped by the United States, together with partners such as the transatlantic community, but also the Asian partners, such as, for instance, the quadrilateral countries, which are increasingly engaging.
What are those quadrilateral countries? What are those?
These are India, Australia, and Japan, okay, together with the United States, and they are trying to facilitate not institutionalized cooperation, but facilitate cooperation in key fields such as defense, free navigation in the Indo-Pacific region, for instance, reshoring of supply chains or reconfiguring supply chains from China, but also they are engaged in military drills and so on and so forth. So they have various high-ranking political meetings and agreements, and this would be one system, more or less shaped by the same rules of the game, the rules-based, so-called rules-based order. But then again, there will be another one in a kind of future, because you ask me, this is a possibility, a kind of positive future scenario. But I think that the way the global affairs are currently developing, I think we will likely end up with something more volatile, where there will be not necessarily a direct confrontation with kinetic means, but we are going to witness a painful decoupling on both sides. So it's a chimeric to anticipate a decoupling only on the side of the United States, because Beijing is exactly is at the same time also interested in decoupling from United States for obvious reasons, because they also fear certain dependencies. They want to be more independent in their international and regional behavior, and they have, of course, also their own agenda. So, of course, the timing was probably too early from a Chinese perspective, and they were hoping for a more stable period of relations until they prepare properly. But due to the unexpected, more or less unexpected elections, previous election, and the Trump's administration, things turned quite quickly into another direction. And in this future scenario that I anticipate, we would probably see a more volatile decoupling. There will be a kind of direct confrontation without kinetic means, but with the application of a full spectrum of other means. So you take all these economic and trade instruments to use pressure or exert influence over the behavior of another state.
A sort of second Cold War, maybe.
Yes, a second Cold War, a Cold War II, as I call it. And exactly. But you use also other means such as disinformation, hybrid threats. Then you use also alliances and partnerships. So you try also to win hearts and minds, and if not, to pressure third countries to more or less comply with certain behavior. I don't see, for instance, in that kind of scenario, a lot of space for neutral or non-aligned countries. So if you would ask me, for instance, whether India would be once again the front runner of a non-aligned movement, as it was the case during the Cold War? I would say no, because I think that India specifically as being projected to become a third economic power in the world in the next decade or two will not have the luxury of staying neutral, and specifically because of its own problems with China and its own competition with China. So the two Asian giants will be involved in a lot of own dynamics of competition and controversial relations. I think that all regional actors will be faced with a choice at some point. They will be oscillating in the meantime between the two major systemic rivals, trying to avoid taking sides, trying to maximize their gains, which I called also as a trend, or as a phenomenon, bilateralization of international relations. Every country for itself, or make every country great again, so to say.
Okay. So in your projections of the future, you see China and Russia working out a kind of alliance between themselves, which will make them a more formidable secondary pole of power. So how do you, well, first of all, I guess I want to step back and ask you what the evidence is for that. So you said that other experts who've looked at this think that the rivalry between those two countries will continue and that you don't agree. So could we first establish the chain of evidence that leads you to think that? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how that might play out in the dynamics of the Second Cold War.
You mean evidence that point to the dragon bear, or evidence point to the multipolarity thesis? Because I don't agree with both. The majority of experts was actually claiming that there will be never a systemic alignment or systemic coordination between China and Russia for at least the last 8 to 10 years. And the second main thesis of the international expert community was that we are going to face multipolarity, which I also have been always found very controversial. So I can explain both.
Well, let's start with the dragon bear. So why is it that you disagree in asserting that China and Russia will work out an alliance between themselves? What's the evidence for that claim?
Okay, so first and foremost, it's not so much about evidence, but it's about trends developments. And I think that trends very often reveal much more about certain patterns of behavior as compared to kind of sum of many facts or sum of many singular events. And this is the way how I approach the issue between China and Russia. In 2014, so I've been, of course, following Russia very, very closely for the last 20 years. So it was nothing new to me when I started following this specific relationship. In 2013, I asked the question, are we going to witness a situation of an axis of convenience between these two powers, or is it a kind of a new mode of shaping the global system? And this is where this was the starting point for me to identify various fields. So I took, of course, the field of security, the field of defense. Then, of course, I moved to technology, finance, trade, agriculture, monetary issues, that means currencies, finance, and more or less, I have been following a spectrum of key domains where I was looking for weak signals, but also for, like I said, for any shifts in the trend.
So you're monitoring all of those areas for trends.
I'm still monitoring all of them. Yes,
okay.
All of the time. So this is the way I established. I established a kind of bigger picture based on these daily observations. And maybe another advantage was, and still is, the fact that I'm also using the language, so I could also look into the national narratives coming from both. So on the one side, of course, the Russian narrative, but then, of course, in cooperation with other colleagues, increasingly the Chinese narrative. And more or less, this relationship evolved under the radar because the expectations were pretty obvious that it's not going to work out because they have many issues. Russia, of course, would never tolerate a Pax Sinica in its direct vicinity. For instance, in Central Asia, in the large Eurasian space. And that makes, of course, perfect sense if we look back at the concepts of geopolitics and Russia as this heartland country operating still in a very, very conservative state power calculations. To remind just one quote about Eastern Europe, who controls Eastern Europe, controls the heartland, and then controls the world.
The world island.
So, yes, the world island. So this is still very much existent in the Russian rationale, and Russia has always to do its geopolitical homework. So they have to always be a few steps ahead of the rest as a matter of state survival, more or less. So this is the way I approach the issue, and my observations resulted, and like I said, this is still an open chapter, and we can, of course, witness major shifts. But for now, specifically, the way the relationship started developing was more or less marked by the events in 2013, 2014, when Russia intervened in eastern Ukraine, annexed Crimea, was isolated by the West, by the United States, by European powers, and also by other transatlantic partners. And this resulted in a situation where Russia needed a strong friend. And it needed it very, very quickly because it was facing a huge currency crisis. During that time, it was put under a lot of economic and trade pressure. It had still its energy interdependence with European powers, and needed it to also diversify it. And this was the time when China basically stepped in and said, okay, let's do it. And they helped them come out of the currency crisis. They initiated a lot of high-ranking political meetings. More or less, it is not a generic development. It is a development that was really top-down. Was taking place top-down, was shaped top-down, and is still in the making. So, is it an interim axis of convenience destined to fail? From the current perspective, I would say no. And the very fact, just to give you one very fresh example from the last weeks, the very fact that now in Afghanistan, the Taliban are taking control over the country. And where did they pay visit to? They went to Moscow, and then immediately after that, they went to China and met with high-ranking political decision makers in these countries, which actually reveal the true preparation for a power transfer in the country following the withdrawal of the US troops, is once again just one very, very small example how the coordination between these two countries is being perceived by third countries, by third state actors.
So that's one of the pieces of evidence, is that when this new power assumes is able to fill the vacuum left by the United States, they go to Russia and then they go to China, and so you're saying so that's evidence that at least third parties are beginning to perceive these two as a power block, because they feel they need to go and talk to both of them, and they wouldn't do that if there wasn't some kind of alliance forming between.
And this is just one indicator, because take also, for instance, the latest tensions between China and India from last year, when Russia actually was more or less neutral to the conflict. They have traditionally very good relationship with India, but now increasingly good and important relationship with China. So they remained neutral during this episode of serious tensions. There were casualties on both sides, and the skirmishes were really threatening to result in a direct military clash. And still, it was Russia that successfully mediated, and they have, for instance, a format which is called RIC, Russia, India, China, a format between the foreign ministers of the three countries. They basically came together and discussed, tried to mitigate. And I think that it will be increasingly difficult for Russia to also navigate between old friends,
right,
and new friends. So these are extremely fluid geopolitical formations. But specifically, the Dragon Bear is one that should be very carefully observed. And I think that the West has overslept it, more or less. So right now they are facing a reality that is already there. Not just in the making. In the meantime, they solved their territorial issues. The common border has been demarcated. They have huge energy deals. They have not just shaped international organizations that were US products, more or less. So a kind of institutional leverage from the Cold War, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, which stayed in place. So take every meaningful socioeconomic system, and you will find at least one important international organization in place. And these were, so to say, organizations that were initiated, shaped, influenced, supported by the United States and partners. So meanwhile, these institutions are also affected by the behavior of the Dragon Bear. Take the example of the United Nations. Take the example of the Security Council of the United Nations. That means that even there, they manage to coordinate actions. They manage to introduce certain steps in order to produce the desired effect. One example was with Syria. There, Russia was the active country. China was abstaining or was following, so to say, suit. Iran is another example. There will be more such examples. But on the other side, when we talk about international organizations, there is meanwhile a whole universe of alternative organizations. And if you look carefully at these organizations, we will find as a main protagonist China, But very often, Russia is also playing a role. So, for instance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an organization that has a mirror organization led by Russia. It's an organization for collective security. And some speculate that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will basically become a kind of alternative to Asian NATO, led by China and Russia at some point. Then there is still this format of the BRICS, together with Russia and with Brazil and India. And this year, BRICS Forum is taking place in India, by the way. And South Africa is also there. Then we have the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, which is more or less absolutely mirror organization of the Asian Development Bank, which is led by the United States. And in any of these specific networks, so take the World Bank, take the International Monetary Fund, you have growing influence by China, but you have also a kind of coordination. Then, of course, the huge topic of infrastructure, connectivity. And you named also at the beginning the role of a hegemon to stabilize, but also to establish its control over transport routes and trade routes and connectivities. And this is basically now also happening on the side of China, where China is introducing its own grandiose, so to say, grandiose. It's not one project, it's a sum of multiple projects at sea or on land, summarized under the buzzword Belt and Road Initiative. But these are indeed long-term oriented, geostrategically oriented infrastructure projects that aim to connect China with the rest of the world. So it doesn't have to take to happen in 5 years from now. It can happen also in 10, 15, 20 years and so on. But the idea is to build simultaneously terrestrial and maritime connectivity, which is alternative to the US-led ones. Because as we know, still 80 to 90% of the global trade takes place via maritime routes. And these are the maritime routes that are secured by the United States. If we look at the map, we see how Europe is being connected through the Mediterranean via the canals and the choke points, such as the Suez Canal, through Africa, and then through the Indian Ocean to the Pacific realm. And all of these important choke points and maritime routes are more or less controlled by the United States. But then again, if you look also once again in the map, we are going to realize that China is eager to build its own alternative corridors. One is currently going through Pakistan, meanwhile with the port in Gwadar at the Indian Ocean, basically allowing China to get an access to the Indian Ocean region and project limited power in a domain which has been reserved to India. On the other side of India, if we look at Myanmar, there is another corridor, which is also allowing China to, for instance, to increase energy supplies, because it is still very much dependent on the same, like I said, same maritime routes that I mentioned before. So this would give another opportunity, another possibility to diversify the corridors. And then there are these 3-4 terrestrial corridors going, by the way, through which province? Through Xinjiang. So if we hear so much about human rights and human rights violations and genocide by Western media when it comes to Xinjiang, I would like to draw your attention also to another aspect, and that is that China needs to stabilize and securitize Xinjiang, because this is a cross point for several terrestrial corridors connecting China to Central Asia, to Russia, and meanwhile to Iran, and even there is one deviation to Turkey, and then via Turkey to Black Sea and Europe. So it's once again
it's very consequential.
Hardcore geopolitics behind it.
Yeah. So what you make a compelling case for China in collusion with Russia, establishing almost a separate world, like their own sets of institutions, their own corridors, their own access to the sea, and trade routes that they can control. What would be the United States play here? I mean, we're declining in power. We find ourselves in this sort of multipolar world. What would be the United States, best shot for maybe not maintaining power as a hegemon, but as maintaining its position as one of the key players?
Well, first and foremost, things do not look that bad for the United States and partners, but it depends on the way how they will approach these trends and what kind of decisions they will make for the future. What kind of future do they anticipate? Because in the end, it's all about the decisions that will be made now, but will impact us in 10, 20 or 30 years from now. And one of the ways I see it actually as a positive outcome for the United States is to engage seriously third countries, so regional alliances, to forge regional alliances, to create meaningful partnerships based on this messianic, but also not just hard power, but also soft power. The combination of both will be, I think, decisive, because it has to be perfectly clear to everyone that if China wins this systemic competition, if China wins the competition during the fourth industrial revolution, so the country that will win the competition over technology, over political economy, over alliances, so manages to forge more alliances and more partnerships, is going to also set its norms and rules and standards of global behavior. And it is chimeric to expect that China will, if it would be this hegemon one day, would impose democratic rules of the game, or there would be a liberal rules-based order one day.
Right.
So this is a starting point for a discussion where I think at some point, like I said previously, all regional actors will have to decide at some point. We are not there yet, and we observe this from their behavior. Like I said, they are currently oscillating. They are trying to maximize their positions, their gains. They want to engage with the one and with the other. And I mean, not just regional powers in Asia, with a few exceptions, of course. For instance, India or Japan, they are certainly more decisive in their foreign policy orientation. But if you look at, for instance, European powers, they are still quite They try to be a loyal security partner of United States, but at the same time, good long-term economic and trade partner of China. And this, at some point, is not going to work. So the earlier these regional powers understand and realize that at some point they will have to take a decision, I think, and they are prepared for it, the better. If not, we are going to face a kind of chaotic transitional period with a lot of fluid constellations, a lot of tensions, a lot of volatility in this gray zone, geographic zone between the rimland and the heartland, which is going to face a lot of proxy wars, a lot of direct confrontations and tensions where the systemic powers are going to try to interfere indirectly and support this conflict party which suits their national interests. And this is going to be mostly in large parts of Africa, in the Indo-Pacific region, then of course Middle East, Central Asia increasingly, and now with Afghanistan threatening to turn into the next geopolitical quagmire, Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, parts of Latin America, and it's going to be this, like I said, gray zone where things are going to turn from worst to worst, more or less, during this transitional period.
Well, that sounds very.
So,
it's a cheerful.
To go back to your question, what should the United States do?
Right.
I think that, and once again, I would refer to history. When were global powers successful? During which periods? It was the periods when they were investing in infrastructure. They were investing in connectivity. And right now, connectivity is not just transport corridors. It's not just about transport corridors. We are living in a new age. We are in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution where the outcome is unclear. Each of the both competitors can actually decide it for itself. There is a competition over artificial intelligence, nanotechnologies, all of these quickly evolving domains. And none of these two competitors will make it on their own. So once again, if they manage to align with third powers in order to actually become a winner of the fourth industrial revolution, and then actually initiate infrastructure investments on their own land, so on their own soil. This, I think, is going to be decisive. This is why we are observing now the trend where, for instance, in Europe, these parts of Europe which were part of the former Soviet bloc are now facing a new initiative called 3Cs initiative, an initiative that is trying to merge and connect the north and the east, squeezed by 3Cs, the Baltic Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Black Sea, and to build exactly this kind of connectivity and infrastructure, be it in energy, in the energy field, or in transport field, or digitalization, with the help of the United States, so that there is a kind of new growth coming out of this part of the region. It's not just about the western part of Europe, but also the eastern part of Europe, and the same applies to the United States. So I don't want to sound like Trump, but it came to my mind that it would probably sound like a Trump motto. But the idea is that United States need their own major and ambitious infrastructure projects for America and for allies. And I think that this is the way how they can actually come out of this this cycle. But this is going to happen in a situation, in a scenario where there is real decoupling, where there is a possibility for home production, home manufacturing, because right now the way global economy has been shaped in the last 30 years, this is not going to happen. We are talking about trillions of investment, and in order to come up with this huge amounts of money in a post-COVID-19 scenario where the socioeconomic repercussions of the pandemic are so great, it's unrealistic to think that it's possible to happen in a 5 to 10 years window.
Right. I wanted to follow up on some comments you made about the fourth industrial revolution. And one of the things that I guess keeps me awake at night is the arms race dynamic that we see between nation states that are vying for the top spot, the hegemon spot. And with some of these technologies, I mean, obviously nuclear power was profoundly dangerous, but I feel like when it comes to something like recursively self-improving artificial intelligence or nanomachines that might be able to self-replicate, you've got, if anything, the potential for even more disaster. Do you think that it's just impossible for nation states to self-regulate because the temptation and the rewards for defecting on that agreement are so great? Or might it be possible to, even in a multipolar world, for the Dragon Bear and the United States to agree to develop artificial intelligence in a way that's very safe? Or is that just sort of ridiculous?
Well, first and foremost, I don't buy the multipolarity thesis. I want to be perfectly clear about it. The way I see it is that at the top of the global affairs as a system, like I said, is this interconnected global capitalist system. And if we are having a helicopter view on it and we are looking at the top of it, we are having a situation where there is one hegemon, one superpower, one global power with global power projections. And then there is this second competitor trying to catch up and, engage with the superpower and compete with it. And there is a meta level, a kind of level in between, which is where all these regional powers are to be found. Where, for instance, Russia is situated, some of the European powers, India, some of the Asian powers, which have certain limited regional power projection capabilities. So due to the fact that this is, in my mind, by no means a multipolarity. This is kind of a new systemic bipolarity, but it is still in a transitionary period. More or less, we can still speak of a unipolar global system, because the moment when one competitor manages to actually catch up, and this is where I named these indicators, we have to carefully observe and analyze the sector of political economy, the technological sector, alliances and partnerships, and then global narratives, rules, standards, norms. This is where we can actually identify a situation where it might turn into systemic bipolarity. But multipolarity is to be found only at this regional level, where there are all these fluid actors constellations, and I named some of them. We have many. Just to give you another example, with rapprochement between Russia and Turkey, for instance, even though that these are two regional competitors, that have been waging wars over ages, not just decades, ages, and they still manage to have a rapprochement based on the overlapping of certain geopolitical or geoeconomic interests when possible. So to clarify this, because it is important to clarify it, because then I will move to the field of arms race and new technologies. So I think the game is once again the same. That means that we are going to face further waves of arms race, and the technologies will get better and more dangerous, in a sense that many of them, and you named, for instance, artificial intelligence, but also take the example of killer robots, for instance, manned drones,
right,
that are meanwhile not just being used without any international legal obligations, but they also decide wars. For instance,
Right.
the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia last year was decided by using these manned drones that were this decisive component that changed the equilibrium and decided the war in favor of Azerbaijan, and were, of course, supplied to Azerbaijan by a regional ally, such as Turkey, for instance, but even Israel. So, and once again, this is another example for fluid regional constellation, actors constellation. So the idea is that because it's a transitionary period, China has zero interest, understandably, in participating in new negotiations on arms, for instance, arms control. So there is this situation right now where China and United States both are applying zero-sum understanding when it comes to these issues. A lot of these specifically these kind of weapon systems are still being developed in secrecy. So we don't even have the information about all of these systems, or where they are deployed and how many, even the number. This has been recently a discussion when it was about the intercontinental ballistic missiles. So on the one side, we are having a situation where these legal, international legal frameworks from the Cold War are more or less disappearing. There is still some space for negotiations between United States and Russia. The example with the New START, this is the last pillar of the old framework. And even there is the effort by Washington to make Russia get the Chinese on the negotiation table, which will never happen under the current circumstances. So on the other side, China is catching up. China is preparing. China wants to be on par with Russia and with the United States, which is understandable given the great power aspirations that Beijing has. So during this period, I'm not expecting that there will be any efforts for yes, but any success in trying to come up with a new international legal framework for instance, when you use this new weapon system, who is allowed to use them, in what kind of situations, under what kind of circumstances, which makes the international environment even more volatile. and makes certain geographic spaces more or less test terrain, as we observed during previous periods of the history of international relations, where certain, for instance, weapons were used and tested, or take, for instance, the Spanish civilian war in 1936, where there was a basically proxy war, and both sides were trying out new technologies. So this is a very, very, very dangerous moment for the international relations. On the one side, there is the understanding we need to do something, but on the other side, there is zero motivation to do something because of this win-lose mentality.
The zero-sum nature of the conflict.
Yes, exactly.
So I guess as a final question, I'll ask you just what your long-term trend predictions are for the next 10 or 20 years. How do you see all this unfolding?
Well, I think mostly I outlined the most important trends. I would like to stress that what many do not realize is that China has already become the main external factor of American domestic politics. So China is everywhere in US media, in political discussions, but the United States can actually only, they can exert only limited influence on China's domestic affairs. Right. Furthermore, international cooperation has become a function of the competition and not vice versa. So if we have competition, if we have cooperation, it's actually only a function of the growing competition and growing systemic rivalry between Washington and Beijing, which doesn't necessarily have to turn into a direct confrontation. So it doesn't have to. I don't necessarily want to point to this kind of drastic and dark future scenario. on the opposite, it can be, like I said, a realization on both sides that direct confrontation will be disastrous for both sides, and that is why they arrange in order to avoid this radical scenario. They arrange two poles of global power. They manage their networks, their partners, their minor allies, and establish control over technology, over political economy within their networks. But it's more or less two separated spaces. Or a more pessimistic scenario will mean a more radical, more consistent mutual decoupling. And it's just the beginning where we are at the moment. Contrary to this more peaceful systemic coexistence. And this mutual decoupling might result in a more confrontational transitionary period where both powers will support proxy wars and clashes, military clashes in the peripheries or in third countries, which suit basically their national interests. I would like finally to stress that it was the USA which has been the biggest source of China's wealth so far, due to the chimerica phenomenon, due to this unprecedented entanglement which began in the 70s and was initiated by the US leadership. And yet, Washington might also become the source of China's demise in the future. And my expectation and anticipation is that the United States will not shy away from advancing this idea under aggravating circumstances of global power competition. So United States will try everything to prevent China from becoming a second system power.
Okay, well, this has been a wide-ranging and fascinating conversation, which is very different from the normal stuff that we cover, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about it.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely.